Leadership International presents 2020 Vision, The Road to Renewal. 2016, a year of refining focus. With Dr. Chan Abraham.
I'd like to share a few thoughts in these closing moments of our conference, asking the question about a more excellent way. It is one of our strap lines. We say we are demonstrating a more excellent way of business, and for those of you who are really committed to your grammar, you may say that that's not correct. You can't have these two superlatives. Of course, it's taken from the Bible. It's archaic language, but it's still beautiful and it makes sense in the right ears. But is it possible, given our world, given all the circumstances, given all the horrors that there are, the uncertainty, the anxiety, is it possible to find a more excellent way? I love the words of some of the greatest scientists, and this is one of them, of course, Albert Einstein, who said, "The right to search for truth also implies a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." So I hope that as we explore this subject in just these next few minutes, we will look for truth in its absolute sense. And I'd like to do it in 3 points. In looking at the question of, is there a more excellent way? One is about the fact that we live in a world of change, and it's also a changing world. That by looking back, and I'd like to look briefly back to the 20th century, I'll explain this in a minute, we can see that there is hope in a darkening world. At least other people have seen it. And finally, looking at our present circumstances, to look at how we can change the world right where we are. So a world of change then, and a changing world. I was recently in Washington, D.C., and I spent some time in the Smithsonian museums. And amongst them, I took this photograph. Those of you who are familiar, of course, will recognize some of the earliest Apple computers. It seems astonishing that our world has moved on with such speed in the area of information technology from those very early days. Some of you are looking at this saying, what? They're a bit on the large side. They were even bigger than that at one point. And this I found fascinating. This is the original mouse, the first mouse built in 1964. And they said, well, it looks like a mouse. It functions like a mouse. It is a mouse. And that is the first mouse. Recently, at Apple's keynote speech in March, Tim Cook, their CEO, regaled the audience by talking about the fact that Apple now has 1 million devices worldwide. And he was saying this is an indicator of how much impact Apple has around the world. And with that comes significant responsibility. My point here right at the beginning in talking about a changing world and a world of change is to see how different organizations and corporations themselves are recognizing this sense of responsibility and impact that their products are having on the world around them. And Tim Cook went on to say this: "We believe strongly that we have a responsibility," I'll explain the circumstances, "we have a responsibility to protect your data and protect your privacy. We will not shrink from that responsibility." This was in the wake of the San Bernardino iPhone case. Do you remember that? When the government of the United States of America were saying that they wanted to be able to force, through the court system, Apple to disclose their ability to get into the iPhone of a now deceased terrorist. And it's interesting, Apple's CEO was saying here, we need to take the government on this because there is a place for privacy. There is a place to respect the rights of the ordinary citizen at the time when government is trying to control and dominate and exercise almost totalitarian responsibility. Good on Apple for taking that approach. And they had a massive consultation actually across the states, which drew enormous support. And staying with the Apple story for just a few moments, this again is very encouraging, interesting, and inspiring. They are very committed to a zero carbon footprint, and 93% of their facilities worldwide now run on renewable energy. They have a zero carbon footprint in 23 countries, including China and the United States of America. Very interesting. And this year, they upgraded this tool called CareKit, which is fascinating. It enables people to better understand data related to their health conditions. It enables them to share their data with family or doctors. And this data itself comprises things like temperature and heart range, as well as the range of motion. So if someone is dealing with Parkinson's disease, then this is of great value to them, as well as people who may just be recovering from surgery. And they're committed to making sure that every single iPhone that is returned to them is recycled in an effective way. Watch a quick video that gives us an insight into Liam. So, fascinating. And they believe that this is an opportunity that they have, as well as a responsibility, to impact the world for the better. And so their mantra is all about thinking differently. We can learn so much in the work that all of us are doing. There are people from many different areas of business activity across the nation, and how inspiring is that? So it is a changing world, and there's immense change, and there are people who want to change things for the better. I want us to look briefly at whether there is hope in a darkening world. And this is a photograph of the atom bomb being dropped over Nagasaki. And I want to turn back some 70, 80 years to understand how people looked at the world that they were facing and where they found hope. And the reason we need to do that is because of all times in our contemporary experience, I don't think any of us has any recollection of a time that is so difficult and challenging and uncertain and anxious as today's is. And whether you voted to stay in Europe or to come out of Europe, what we need today is to have a consensus where we come together, where the divisions are healed, and where as a nation we can move forward. And some of our reflections on the past century are very helpful in this regard. In 1926, the world saw the greatest stock market crash it had done. And it led from 1929 to 1933 to the Great Depression in America, which then had huge knock-on effects right across the Western world. I want to, in this part of the talk, to talk a little bit about what was happening in the States and also look at their experience, because it is directly applicable to our circumstances. And these were people who could not afford to eat. And this is actually from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. It's a photograph I took when I was there in Washington, D.C. recently. On the left-hand side, you see two images, a man and a woman who are clearly very poor. They're outside a shanty, a shack, because the experience of millions of rural dwellers in America in that period was reduced to that. And on the right-hand side, you have these bronze figures that represent what you saw in the earlier photograph of men queuing up in a soup line because there was no food. And on 3 separate occasions in the early 1930s, because of poor farming techniques, large parts of the American Midwest were reduced to dust bowls. You'll have seen photographs of trucks sinking into sand because the topsoil had been eroded as a consequence of people of them over farming without sufficient knowledge as to what they should do. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who people at the time did not know, was a man confined to a wheelchair from the age of 39 because he'd contracted polio. Whenever he was seen giving a talk, he was always sitting down behind a desk or appeared to be in a chair, which was a chair, but it was actually one of his armchairs that he'd fashioned himself into a wheelchair. And he was their wartime president as well. One of the things among the many wise things he said was this: the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. So faced with extraordinary challenges, dire poverty, to the extent that people were believing that what they had thought was the American dream, that if you work hard enough, it will all come together, they were beginning to believe that had all gone. There was no longer any sense of hope, any sense of possibility of future progress. And in came this leader, a crippled man, who at this point, in this context, was saying, look, progress is about how we look after those who need, not just provide for those who have everything. And not long after that, this is of absolutely crucial importance to our understanding the way in which people must have felt at that time and the way they responded. The world was plunged into a second great world war. America didn't enter until 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But there were three key dictators, Mussolini, Hitler, and Tojo, from Japan, whose total viewpoint and aspiration, ambition was domination and control. And aspects of that have never left the human psyche. Let's be real about that. It still is present. There are people who want to dominate and control and take away the freedom of the individual. And this is another one of those great comments that I saw. He said this: we have faith that future generations will know that here, in the middle of the 20th century, there came a time when men of goodwill found a way to unite and produce and fight to destroy the forces of ignorance and intolerance and slavery and war. What Roosevelt did in order to conquer the problems with the Great Depression was to engage in something he called the New Deal. He brought about their first form of Social Security, but also set about seeking to ramp up the industrial performance of the nation. But it was actually when they entered the war that their performance actually moved on exponentially because of the need to engage in the war effort. And of course they did. Tanks and planes were produced at an extraordinary rate. But in order to achieve that, he challenged the people. And maybe it's some of that challenge that we're facing today as we look forward to the future. And that is what takes us to how we can change the world, I think, right where we are. Given all of the uncertainties and the lack of faith that people have in the political class, it would be logical for human beings, for people right across this nation to give up. But I want us to ask the question, what might have happened in 1939 in this country and in 1941 in the States and right across the Commonwealth, across the free world, if people at that time had said, we don't know what to do, because the aggressors were so powerful, the Axis powers were immense, they were storming on, and they had much more of a game plan than anyone else did. Their plan was to dominate, to rule, to control, to take away people's freedom. And the fear that probably was in people's minds at the time, I would say, is with us today, isn't it? And that's why the context of where we are is so important. For almost everybody who's listening to this talk today, the fact that we've had a referendum which says we must come out of the European Union, and we shall, there is fear. There is fear about the future. I understand that. But I believe that the future and the way we change the world right where we are is by seeking to overcome fear in all of its forms. Again, going back to our friend Albert Einstein, he said this: as long as I have any choice in the matter, I shall live only in a country where civil liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law prevail. Now, why do I say this? It is because I believe in a manner that as never before, almost going back to Magna Carta, the ordinary citizens of this country need to stand up and proclaim their right and their aspiration to be free. Not to be free just to do whatever we want, that's not the point, but to actually live in a world that is truly democratic. When we look at all, we had the EU referendum, and within a very short space of time, people say, can we have another one? I couldn't understand, I couldn't get my head around that. What happens in a democratic society if you have a vote? Obviously, if it's flawed, that's another matter. And so freedom is about seeking to do what you want to do, but within the appropriate confines of the law and democratic principles. He said something wonderful as well, Franklin Roosevelt, and I want to share with you a few more of his words. At that time, he said this, they who seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not an order. So that is something which I would call upon every reasonable, thinking, intelligent British citizen to think about whether you are enjoying true freedom, liberty, and whether all of the other people in the nation are. Because in some places, it seems to me that freedom and liberty is enjoyed by some, but not by others. It's interesting, we have some colleagues here from an organization called Christian Concern. They run the Christian Legal Center. And although you may have picked some of this up in in the media, it's not given a great deal of publicity. But in our free country, people who are actively committed Christians, just simple, ordinary people, air stewardesses, nurses, magistrates, because they're holding to their core beliefs, they're not trying to force it down anyone's throat, they're losing their jobs, simply because they believe as Christians. Now, you might be a Muslim, you might be a Hindu, you might be a Buddhist, you may be a secularist, you may be an atheist, an old atheist, or a new atheist. There are some things called new atheists. Does it mean that as a result of your beliefs, you should be discriminated against and lose your job, your livelihood? But that's exactly what's happening in our nation. How is it possible for us as Free Britain to permit that to happen? How do we justify that? The Christian Legal Center are doing some amazing work, pro bono, to defend these cases, taking many of them up to the European Court of Human Rights. That's because Britain is actually compromising people's rights to civil liberty and freedom. It's not new and it's not an order. He went on to say this, though, moving on from what I've just mentioned, and coming directly to where we are today. He was saying that America is not a country which can be confounded by the appeasers, the defeatists, the backstairs manufacturers of panic. In other words, what's the relevance to us today? We are in a period of uncertainty. That's the reality of it. There is now a new prime minister, and we trust that she will be properly guided to form a good cabinet, and we'll have stability. We'll have clarity around all aspects of, strategic aspects of British life. But in our country, there are many people who will manufacture panic. Do you know, in that leadership race for the leadership of the Conservative Party, what I found very revealing was the way in which motherhood was denigrated by the media. Whatever Andrea Leadsom said or didn't say may or may not have been wise. That's not something I will enter into. But the point at which people start saying, oh, do you think because you're a mother you have any special skills? If you're a mother, you have special skills. I know that. I'm a father, and I have certain skills, but I could never do what my wife did. And I wouldn't be able to feed my children. Let's get real about it. Let's call out this liberal elite who control the media and think they can dominate our views and our thinking by their particular views. Motherhood is a noble profession, as is fatherhood. And both equip you well to do other things in life. If you're not a parent, you still have skills, and it doesn't stop you running for the leader of any party. We should simply have said that instead of pushing that poor woman out of the race. It is a country, he said, which talks out its problems in the open where any man can hear them. This is a problem. This is a big problem in this country today, because there are certain things which will not be entertained in the public square for debate. They will not be given the opportunity. The things I'm sharing this morning, I'm very happy to go on national television and talk about them and debate them with anyone. But I dare say there were people who say, oh no, I don't want to talk about that. Why? This is Britain. This is the place of freedom. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about anything you want to talk about. We may not agree, but we should have the debate. And he was saying this. Remember, this is in the middle of war. This is 1941, when he was speaking to Congress, saying we need to enter this great war. We have just now engaged in a great debate. It was not limited to the halls of Congress. It was argued in every newspaper on every wavelength, over every cracker barrel in the land. Does it sound familiar? This is where we are today. This is where we've just come from. That's why I think this is so reflective of what happened in 1941. That great nation was faced with this awesome challenge. Do you know, Nazi sympathizers from America were telling the Fuhrer at the time, it will be a piece of cake to get into America because they can't support themselves. They are at loggerheads. They've had a Great Depression. They are losing any sense of their moral compass. You can walk in. That's what the Nazis were being told, and that's what they believed. And Roosevelt knew that he needed to get the nation galvanized to stand against what was an awesome threat. Do you know? Do you have any sense? Do we have any recollection of how awful Nazism, fascism was? 6 million Jews murdered just because they were Jewish, and other minority groups as well. That could have been the story of the world into which you and I were born. But hope in a changing and a darkening world, that's what our forebears considered as being important. It was finally decided and settled by the American people themselves. As far as Europe is concerned, it's settled. And now we need to move on. The decisions of our democracy, I think this is amazing how similar our position is to theirs all those years ago. The decisions of our democracy may be slowly arrived at, but when that decision is made, it is proclaimed not with the voice of any one man, but with the voice of 130 million. That was their population at the time. It's binding on all of us, and the world is no longer left in doubt. They were talking about entering the war. They were talking about a most significant decision, the outcome of which they could not know. And therefore, the fear must have been palpable in every person's heart. Here in Washington, he said, we're thinking in terms of speed and speed now. And I hope that this watchword will find its way into every home in the nation. We shall have to make sacrifices, every one of us. The final extent of those sacrifices will depend upon the speed with which we act now. See, this is very important. He was saying we do not want to have a vacuum. We need to have hearts and minds. We need to have everyone coalescing around the common vision. And they moved into an extraordinary period, one of sacrifice, certainly. They gave up a lot in order to become the munitions and armament factory of the Allied process to defeat Nazism. And we have so much to learn from them. He went on to say this. Where does Britain come in? He said, the British are stronger than ever in the magnificent morale which has enabled them to endure all the dark days and the shattered nights of the past 10 months because of the ceaseless bombing of London and all our major cities, the Blitz, when many lives were lost, and also large proportions of our cities were just razed to the ground by the Nazi bombing. But the British resolve remained firm and strong because people believed there was something to live for and, if necessary, to die for. They have the full support of all people throughout the world who still think in terms of the great freedoms. I believe that in the heart of every man and woman there resides a desire to be free. But because of the way we do life in Britain, our approach to understatement, the silent majority, we are often willing to give the small, vocal majority the opportunity to control and dominate our culture, our way of life, and to transform us into what they want us to be. And the government's attempt at British values was a lackluster approach which does not reflect British values in their entirety. So is it a hopeless time? I also visited the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and helped by people from China, they'd hewed out this great monument, and it's one of his quotes. He said, "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." That great leader who perished in 1968, having delivered his great I Have a Dream speech in 1963, and I went and stood on the steps where he'd done that in front of the statue of Abraham Lincoln. He was one who spoke in a time of terrible lostness in America. There are very few black people in this group here today. But if any one of us, whatever our race, our background, our color, if you were told that you had to live a segregated life, that you had to give up your place to someone on the bus because of their color, and you could you could only be at the back of the bus, and your children could not go to the same school as any other child because of the color of your skin. What kind of world would that be? That was the world they were living in. Hopeless. But even into that situation, there was hope. And I want to encourage you in that what I'm saying today is not a hopeless story. It's saying we have the possibility of transforming our world. So how do we do it? Easy, really. Easy, in one sense. The easy part is knowing it deep in here and being ready to do it. So it's what we call 2020 vision. It is that. It's 2020. It's where will we be in 4 years' time. But it's also, what does a normal person see? 2020 vision is normal vision. And that's what we don't have. Because over a period of time, and I've talked about this many times before, and I won't dwell on it today, I believe that a mist has settled over the psyche and the culture and the perceptions of the people of this nation. We don't see life clearly. We're a bit like some of the people who were on, if you've read the Odyssey, story of Odysseus or Ulysses, after the Trojan War, he had to get back home. He had many horrible things along the way. And one point he got to an island, a bit like my friend, shipwrecked, and his friends all lost a sense of who they were. They were deceived. And I believe there's some of that. So we need to get back to clarity. And one way may be people like me giving a bit of a hard dose of the real medicine to say, folks, this is the way life is really. This is life, not the way you think about it. We've talked about discipline, the fact that teachers can no longer keep control in schools. We've talked about the fact that family life is breaking down. All of those things are important. We need to see the problems, whatever they are, and then we need to fix them. And that's what we are committed to doing. When we were abroad, my wife saw this and said, take a photograph. And I thought, it's great. In this brick wall, solid brick wall, life is emerging. No possibility of that happening. How on earth? And maybe that's how we feel sometimes. That there is no way out. This is so dark. There's so much fear. There's so much anxiety. Life will find a way. That sounds like something from Star Trek, actually. But life will find a way and help us to move forward. And I want to close, really, by referencing a great author and philosopher of the 18th century. Thomas Paine lived during the time of the American War of Independence. That's what they call it. We call it the American Revolution. There's a bit of a difference of view. That little spat that took the Americans away from the British Empire. And in a series of pamphlets, 16 pamphlets over a number of years called The American Crisis, he started this by saying this. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. He was talking about engaging with the might of the British Empire in war. I am talking about the fact that we need to engage with the reality of what is going on in our world and not shrink from it. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. If you and I, friends, can have a vision of what a better world, a renewed world looks like, that is the beginning of enabling us to move forward towards a position of success. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. In other words, if everything is given to us on a plate, and we know this for certain, we don't really value it. But it is in dearness only that everything has its value. In other words, the fact that we are in a struggle, the fact that we have fear, the fact that there's been this level of uncertainty, division, and even the horrible things through the recent referendum, gives us the opportunity to prize dear the healing of the wounds and the bringing together of our communities. So, is this a more excellent way? I close with the words of Steve Jobs, the outgoing CEO, now deceased, of Apple. This is what he said. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. He and his company did. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. The people of this nation in wartime Britain did as well. The question is, can we? The way to do it is to make up our minds and to begin to make progress across this bridge of change from wherever we may be now to where we need to be in order to make progress along the road to renewal, to find a more excellent way and to change the world right where we are. Can we do it? Yes. Thank you very much.